Okay, so this video is going to be some thoughts about Jesus. Recently, I've been thinking about how we often say, and people say, that Jesus was fully human, just like us, except without sin. And I mean that just that kind of rolls off the tongue easily. Yeah, just like fully human like us, just no sin. So, pretty much just like us. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized actually, no. Actually, the less he is like us. Because if you stop and think about it, what we are pretty much is mostly sin. Us sinful human beings are dominated by our imperfections. Everything we do is pretty much imperfect and infected by our sinfulness. So what happens is people, they start to tend to think of human nature as being a flawed thing because they can't really imagine what it would be like to be perfect. And what is perfection anyway? So we know by faith Jesus is perfect. So what is that? So he was fulfilling the great commandments at all times. He was loving God with all his being and his neighbor as himself in God. So that's what he was doing from the instant of his conception, at every moment of his existence. So that's like, what was it like to be Jesus? Yeah, that's what he was doing. He was living in God constantly. And so we can say, yeah, well, that's without sin. That's true. But that's not how we live. We don't. It's like our resemblance to that is usually, extremely different. Now certainly there have been some really holy and great saints that began to live every moment in the love of God. Pretty much, there are some. Certainly, Our Lady did that constantly from the instant of her conception. That's what she did. She did the same as Jesus because she didn't have any sin to impede her. So that's what she did. That's what her life was about, was living in the love of God, for the love of God, in the love of God, constantly every moment of her existence. That's what Jesus was doing. And it's not that easy to wrap your mind around. It's like, that's what he was doing when he was preaching in the synagogue or healing a person or just walking along the road. Yeah, that's what he was doing. When he was teaching the parables, how could he walk and chew gum, so to speak, like that? But he could do it, yeah, because it was God's will. That's what Jesus said. I only do what I see my Father doing. So because he was doing only God's will, he could be doing these things, and not visibly. You couldn't see the limitless charity involved in what he was doing, because they looked somewhat normal things to be doing. Preaching or healing was a little bit normal, but not that normal. And then you get to his passion, where that's a special time. That's where he really set everything aside and completed the exposition of what real love is, and showed us, because when he came into existence, he knew he would take the last place in everything. In everything, there could be no one who could take a lesser place than him. That's why he said he came to serve. And that. And the final gift was the gift of his life in accepting death without deserving it, and loving his enemies, accepting everything the way he did, which, you can study the Passion and see, what happened. So I thought I would mention that. So that's the thing, is that when we say, somebody will say, oh, I'm only human, that's not really what they mean. What they mean is, I'm only a sinful human. Because sinfulness is not an essential part of our humanity. That's my point. No. Sinfulness, imperfection, selfishness, things like that most of us consider to be quote unquote normal, because everyone they know has those tendencies. Yeah, because we don't know. We don't really know Jesus and Mary. They didn't have those tendencies. We know by faith. We'll say it. Oh, they were without sin. But what was it like? Very different. It's hard for us to imagine that because everything we do is contaminated by selfishness. So that's a good pastime in life to, as we go, to learn a little bit more how to live in that perfect love that they did. Many saints did that very well. St. Francis and a lot of saints, of course, St. Joseph, St. John the Baptist, St. Mary Magdalene. Yeah, many saints followed along that narrow way, which, we're trying to just latch onto a tiny bit of the first step. So that's it for that thought.